She had told herself, on the walk up the stone steps beneath the restaurant's soft lanterns, that she would keep it simple. A polite smile, 2 hours of pleasant conversation, and then back to her notebooks and the meeting notes waiting on her desk. The table by the window was set with white linen, a small candle trembling in the draught, and a vase of pale peonies. Charlotte Whitmore adjusted the shawl over her knees, her sketchbook balanced on her lap like a familiar talisman, and rolled forward with practiced ease along the polished floor. People glanced, the way they usually did when a Whitmore daughter entered a public room, curiosity sharpened by headline fragments. She had been careful not to read the morning's papers. That had been an act of self-preservation, not denial. Across the room, a man with grease under his nails and a jacket smelling faintly of oil looked up from a napkin where he had been doodling a sideways motorcycle. He had stood because someone had waved him over to the wrong table, an awkward volunteer from an app arranged by a friend who thought romance might be a good joke on a rainy Thursday. Marcus had sworn the app would be foolproof. Marcus had lied by omission. Jake Turner sat, blinked, and smiled the way a man does when he realizes he has not been roped into a setup that requires cufflinks. He smelled like motor oil and coffee, his hair still carrying the warmth of the garage's heat lamp. His hands bore the dull calluses of someone who could coax a carburetor into cooperation and sketch the outline of a hand with equal tenderness. He only realized the woman in front of him was not the city's PR coordinator when the waiter, with an apologetic bow, slid a menu into his hands and said, "Mr. G is on his way. Please enjoy the evening." Charlotte had been framing a line in her mind to deflect small talk, an opening about the exhibit she was coaching at the foundation, when she looked up and found a stranger leaning across her candlelight with a grin that disarmed before it could settle into charm. For a moment, they both considered walking away from the script. Then politeness took over. "Sorry," Jake said without ceremony, and for the first time that night, an entire future that included grease-stained jeans and crooked grin scraped across her mind like a pencil. He moved his hands in a way that suggested apology and curiosity both. His fingers tapped the edge of a paper napkin and revealed a quick, economical sketch of a truck slipping through rain. Charlotte, who kept a sketchbook like a ledger of what surprised her, recognized the line posture, the way his wrist anchored the motion. It said more than words. "You're not Daniel," she said, and it was not unkind. Her voice had the precise cadence she used when reading back an artist's critique. "I'm Charlotte." "Jake," he said, I'm supposed to be somewhere else." He laughed, a short sound. "But it's not trouble." Charlotte had been framing a line in her mind to deflect small talk, an opening about the exhibit she was coaching at the foundation, when she looked up and found a stranger leaning across her candlelight with a grin that disarmed before it could settle into charm. For a moment, they both considered walking away from the script. Then politeness took over. "Sorry," Jake said without ceremony, and for the first time that night, an entire future that included grease-stained jeans and crooked grin scraped across her mind like a pencil. He moved his hands in a way that suggested apology and curiosity both. His fingers tapped the edge of a paper napkin and revealed a quick, economical sketch of a truck slipping through rain. Charlotte, who kept a sketchbook like a ledger of what surprised her, recognized the line posture, the way his wrist anchored the motion. It said more than words. "You're not Daniel," she said, and it was not unkind. Her voice had the precise cadence she used when reading back an artist's critique. "I'm Charlotte." "Jake," he said, I'm supposed to be somewhere else." He laughed, a short sound. "But it's no trouble." "Unless you are expecting a man in a suit with too much cologne." Before she could answer, the door opened and a man with a perfectly coiffed hairline and a presence like a press release slid in. Daniel G. He carried entitlement like a coat. The room folded politely around him, some tables pivoting with the economy of people who knew how to trade a glance for a story. Daniel glanced at Charlotte, at the wheelchair, and the smile that followed had the practiced shine of someone who could never quite believe his own luck. Jake stood because courtesy and instinct demanded it. The table that had been intended for Daniel's conversation with the Whitmore PR team felt suddenly smaller. Daniel introduced himself with a laugh that flattened the room, then leaned forward and began to speak in that tone some men used when they wanted to measure other people for leverage. "Ah, so you're Charlotte Whitmore. Heard about you. Isn't the family throwing a charity tonight?" Charlotte answered with the trimmed politeness of someone accustomed to being observed. "We support several initiatives," she said, "but tonight I'm just—" She let the phrase hang, and Jake, without thinking of class or consequence, filled it for her with a warmth that surprised them both. "Here for a quiet meal," he said. Daniel's smile tightened. Quiet is a kind of luxury. He turned to Jake with a look that put ownership on the air. "And you are?" His voice made the question a trespass. "Jake," he said, simply, "Turner." There was a subtle pivot in the room after that. A few patrons felt the small boundary being drawn. Others, indifferent, returned to their forks. Daniel's interest soured into thinly veiled judgment. "You with her?" he asked, aimed for polite authority and landed on suspicion. "No," Charlotte said. "It wasn't a refusal so much as a correction. I'm with myself." Someone at the next table coughed as if at the sight of a minor public scandal. Daniel offered his hand to Charlotte with the theatricality of a man who auditioned for power. "Perhaps I should introduce myself properly." He reached out, and Jake's hand, the one that smelled of oil and soot, closed over the back of his chair for a moment, an anchor. The movement was small, protective without show. For reasons she herself couldn't name, Charlotte liked the solidity beneath his fingers. She let her smile soften. The waiter returned with the first course, and the conversation shuffled like cards. The wrong table farce dissolved, but didn't leave without leaving a mark. Daniel made a point of telling a story about his latest venture, the sort of sentence that implied ownership of everything it touched. Jake answered some questions about a hometown mechanic's recent win in a local restoration contest. Charlotte found herself listening to both accounts, cataloging texture. Daniel's laughter like polished wood, Jake's like worn leather, and wanting to respond to honesty alone. After the drinks and a dessert they didn't really need, Jake stood to leave. He had been meant to be elsewhere. His phone, unwittingly buzzing in his pocket, had the voicemail from Marcus. "Mate, how's dinner with the wrong table? Hope they're not buying you champagne." He laughed and said goodbye, exchanging a note, an apology that also carried a sketchful grin, then left with a promise to redraw the evening in the margins of his life. Outside the lantern glow and the clack of heels, Charlotte lingered. The evening had been a small detour from her carefully calibrated schedule. Daniel's text came 2 minutes later, a message that started polite and ended with an implication that she owed an explanation for this odd happenstance. He called the tone of her life into question by the mere way he wielded his fascination. She watched Jake disappear down the cobbled lane and felt, for the first time in months, an unsteady curiosity. There was a life outside of event calendars and family strategies, lived in the grease-streaked hands of someone who could also sketch the corner of a rain-slicked bridge. She would not have labeled the stirring she felt as attraction yet. It was, more accurately, an inkling of a crack in the armor she wore for other people's comfort. She closed her sketchbook and made a judgment. She would go see the garage in the morning, just to be kind, just to hold on to the sensation. Stay with us through this story. If it moves you, subscribe for more. The garage smelled of hot metal and burnt coffee the next afternoon. Fluorescent lights hummed, and pools of late winter sun slid over overflowing tool drawers. A Ford pickup sat propped on a jack like an animal at rest. Jake wiped his hands on a rag, the same movements he'd been performing since he was old enough to reach a spark plug. And for a second, he looked like an ordinary man at work. Marcus clapped him on the back, then retreated with the conspiratorial smirk of a man who'd engineered a meeting he now watched with the detached glee of a director. When the door rolled up and Charlotte entered, the place took a small collective breath. Mechanics shifted, cup handles stopped mid-sip, and a radio playing old R&B faded into the clinks of metal. She had chosen jeans, an act of deliberate leveling, and a coat that pulled at the shoulders. Her wheelchair clicked across the concrete. She kept her sketchbook open on her lap, fingers running over the page as if touching a familiar spine. "Hey," Jake said, half standing from where he had been hunched over the front bumper. He stepped closer than necessary, like someone unpracticed at being nervous around women who usually sat at the other end of a boardroom table. "You painted my coffee," she said by way of greeting, nodding at a smear of oil on his palm. Jake rubbed the oil on his jeans. "That was my homage to modern art," he grinned. It was a domestic kind of humor, the kind she liked, one that didn't require navigation of code switching. "You kicked up a storm at dinner last night." She had. The storm had been smaller than the tabloids would make it, but storms had a way of arriving at the precise coordinates where someone had left something fragile unattended. "They were rude," she said, "to you and to the idea of people who work with their hands." Jake shrugged. "I can take a joke, most of the time." They settled into the rhythm of a friendship that wanted more but didn't rush. Charlotte began to come by on Friday afternoons, rolling past the row of motorcycles and leaning into the smell of oil and rubber like it was the scent of an undiscovered city. She would bring sandwiches, grilled cheese wrapped in foil, and a thermos of tea. She had a particular way of cutting the sandwiches diagonally, the halves like small boats. Jake always ate his with his hands and always left the crust. Marcus swore that the sight of a Whitmore heir eating in the grease-stung sunlight had made his week. There were small domestic rituals that stitched them together. She sketched a motorcycle fender in charcoal. He showed her how to tighten a bolt without stripping the head. She read to him from a book on modern sketch techniques. He let her try on his old baseball cap and joked that it made her look like a getaway driver. When they laughed, it felt like a room filling with light. Jake found a place in Charlotte's life between appointments and PR obligations. She, quietly, found a place in his, a corner of the garage where an extra stool sat. She brought a steadying presence into an environment where the worst crisis usually involved a stalled engine and a missed deadline. He brought to her a solidity that had nothing to do with his paycheck and everything to do with the way he kept his promises. That was the currency between them, small, everyday trust. They were not naive. Both carried histories. Charlotte's accident, the one that changed her mobility, had been in a season that still felt raw and private. She did not speak about the hospital rooms or the sudden privacy of her own thoughts at night. She spoke instead about constructs and light and the stubbornness of ink on paper. Jake carried an old wound of his own, an ex-wife with a tendency for drama and a sister who needed him to take on parental tasks long before he felt ready. Those things had steadied him more than they had damaged him. Still, the city is a small village when Muddy draws lines. Someone noticed the odd friendship between Whitmore's daughter and the mechanic with oil-smudged fingers. A freelance photographer caught a candid on a Thursday afternoon. Charlotte laughing with greasy hands reaching for the teapot. Jake's grin bare in the sun. It wasn't embarrassing until it was. Headlines stitched together an insinuation as if it were a fact. "Whitmore's daughter spotted with local mechanic," read a tabloid headline, the kind that thrives on the spectacle of mismatch. William Whitmore saw that photo on a large screen in his office and felt his mouth go dry. His world was built on reputations and tidy narratives. He called with a calm that was a thin veneer. "Charlotte," he said, "we need to talk." The conversation that followed was gentler than a reprimand and harder than an accusation. William measured his sentences the way a man measures his investments. He spoke of optics and family legacy, of boardroom murmurs and donor discomfort. He asked questions with the politeness of a man who had always been answered by deference. Charlotte answered not as an heiress, but as the woman who had scraped elbows to learn the angle of light. "He makes me laugh," she said. "He sees me." "Seeing is not always the same as understanding," William replied.
His voice carried an urgency that was as much fear as it was control. This connection, it could be exploited. People will draw conclusions. Charlotte thought of the sketchbook in her bag, the way Jake's line could find the truth of an object with 3 strokes. She thought of the way he had steadied herself on a sloping curb. She said, "I can handle narrative. I can tell my story." William's silence was like a ledger closing on a line that hadn't been reconciled. "Be careful," he said finally. "We can help with discretion." Charlotte refused the help, not with theatricality, but with a careful, clear no. She told him she would not be a story to be managed. The call ended without fireworks, only with the low-grade hurt that comes from the knowledge that a parent is an ally only up to a point. Then the pressure turned more invasive. A man in a dark suit began to show up at the garage with questions that were too pointed to be casual. He would sit in the corner, sip a coffee he did not finish, and hand over a card with a polite thinness. He left his name blank on purpose. The man offered arrangements, financial incentives that smelled like bribes, ultimatums braided into offers. Jake's hands clenched when the man spoke. He had no illusions about his place in any bank ledger. What he had was his integrity, a small stubbornness that the man in the suit misunderstood as quaint. "You'll want to stop seeing her," the man said once, leaning forward until his knees were close to Jake's. Jake set down a wrench. "No," he said, "there are boundaries." The man smiled as if hearing a joke. "You don't understand how the world I move in works." He made it a lesson rather than a threat. For Charlotte's sake, it would be better if you kept your distance. Jake felt the room thin. His little garage, usually filled with the ordinary music of work, radio static, the hiss of air compressors, seemed suddenly too small for the kind of ugliness the man brought. He wanted to say the obvious things about love and dignity, but he felt a prudence that was not cowardice. He had bills to pay, he had a sister to consider. He also had a growing sense of responsibility that had nothing to do with money. Charlotte, for her part, was not dismayed by threats, only by the way they suggested other people could decide the course of her life for her. She filed the encounter with the man in the suit like a drawing note, a sharp line that needed context. She invited Jake to dinner the next night in a quiet cafe that smelled of bread and lemon. "We'll talk about strategy," she said. They spoke like two people who were learning to argue in ways that expanded rather than contracted trust. She told him that she did not need protection in the paternalistic sense. She needed partnership. He said he wanted to be there, but worried for their safety. She understood the calculation of risk. Jake understood the calculus of small sacrifices. They agreed, imperfectly and bravely, to carry one another's burdens without letting the burdens decide them. The tabloid's next round came harder. Someone fed a photograph to a gossip column showing Charlotte and Jake in a moment of casual closeness at the mechanic stand. The accompanying caption twisted intimacy into scandal. Social feeds rang with comments that slid from curiosity into cruel mockery. Jake found himself reading comments in the small hours with his coffee growing cold. He found also, to his surprise, messages of support from customers who had seen him offer kindness without pretense. The city revealed itself as a crowd that could cheer and savage in the same breath. Then the breaking point came on a bridge in the rain. Charlotte had been restless for days, an ache that did not have a name. William's heavy-handed calls, the man in the suit's veiled threats, the endless low-level drone of public scrutiny, had the cumulative effect of wearing at the edges of her patience. She wanted to feel raw wind and the honest threat of weather, rather than the manufactured storms of other people's stories. She drove, or rather, she had someone chauffeur her car to the bridge, and parked with the engine off. Rain slicked the roadway like a sheet of pewter. Cars swished by, headlights painting quick strokes across the pavement. She sat in her wheelchair at the bridge's rail and watched the river below, the water black and rushing. The rain came in hard curtains that blurred the city lights. Jake had called twice that day. He was working a late repair and prayed briefly, an instinct rather than a creed, that she would be safe. Marcus left a voicemail, urgent. "Dude, she left a sketch on the counter and I think it looks like the bridge." Jake heard the alarm in Marcus's voice and left the shop without his coat. When he turned onto the bridge, the rain hit like fingers, cold and insistent.
He saw her silhouette where the streetlight pool made a halo, and his heart kicked into a fit that felt like bone-deep warning. He parked, grabbed a raincoat, and ran. He found her at the railing, steady despite the shaking in her hands. She was not a figure of surrender. She was a person whose edges had been hammered by pressure until they felt brittle. "Charlie," he said, breathless. The rain rung against his coat. She did not turn at first. Then she folded back into herself with a sound that was both small and enormous, a sob that carried months of refusal. "I can't," she started, but the sentence unraveled. Jake's hands found her shoulders. He held her with the deliberate calm of someone who understood how to brace something weighted. "You're not doing this alone," he said. Words are fragile in the face of a precipice. She muttered something about being tired of people making choices for her, tired of headlines that rewrote her as a prop. He listened. He did not attempt grand pronouncements. He pressed his palm to the small of her back and leaned in close enough that the heat from his body cut a small shelter in the rain. A car screeched to a halt, headlights flared and a voice called out. Someone else had seen. A figure moved forward, an off-duty nurse who worked at a clinic nearby. She approached with the steady authority of a person who had sat with patients in their worst hours and had learned how to anchor without flickers of judgment. She knelt beside Charlotte and spoke low, offering a hand that did not demand answers but simply extended relief. The rescue was not cinematic in the way movies stage epiphanies. There were practicalities. Calls to emergency lines, the slow, uneven, and compassionate language of professionals, the careful extraction from the railing's edge, the dry towels offered like blankets of solidarity. Jake stayed the whole time with the sober intensity of someone who had decided to be present, to be responsible for the small acts, talking, keeping eyes on her, pressing a coat around her shoulders. He would later say, in a voice that never had to be loud, that the thought of losing her had hit him more brutally than any engine's backfire. He had seen what grief could do to presence and would not be a participant in it. In the hospital afterward, somewhere between the beepings and the fluorescent sleep, Charlotte apologized in a way that was not wholly hers. The guilt belonged to a family narrative that had taught her to shrink when others grew. Jake shook his head. "You don't have to explain to me how you feel," he said. "You tell me. I listen." They spoke then, later, in quiet rooms and over small dinners, about shame and agency. Charlotte said the word she had not given voice to before, that it had felt like people were choosing her life for her, deciding the terms of her autonomy on the basis of her appearance. Jake confessed the vulnerability he had felt, how easy it would have been to walk away in the face of the suit's offers, to choose the safe road. They found in the aftermath a trench of truth where they could lay down their defenses. There was a scene, not theatrical but searing, where Charlotte lifted her sketchbook and showed him a page she had made in the hospital. Lines of the bridge in the rain, a small figure in the center holding another's hand. "I drew it like that before," she said, "because I wanted to remember how it felt when someone stayed." Jake looked at the lines and found his breath. He had no art degree, no insider vocabulary for grief, but he had the steady muscle of someone who stayed. After the bridge, the public frenzy took a softer turn. News cycles can wear out. The notorious hunger for scandal is often satiated by the next bright thing. William Whitmore, whose control had been pricked by the scene on the bridge as much as by the tabloid pulse, came to see Charlotte quietly. He did not apologize with grand gestures. He brought flowers with a note that read like a stricken accounting.
I misjudged how you need to be seen." It was conditional, tentative, but it was a gesture trimmed of pretense. He told Jake in a clipped exchange that carried no flourish that he would not oppose a relationship on account of public appearances alone. It was not full forgiveness, it was a recalibration. The man in the suit stopped appearing at the garage. Whether his employers had decided the cost was greater than the gain, or whether Charlotte's quiet insistence had made a private ledger of the wrongness of coercion, the pressure transmuted into something less vicious. Jake continued to face small slights in the grocery lines and the quieter cuts that class divides can inflict. But the small gestures of ordinary grace began to stack. Neighbors bringing casseroles, customers leaving notes about how his kindness had mattered. Romance does not tidy itself into a single tidy arc. There were missteps, dates that were misread, words that landed wrong. There were moments when Charlotte retreated into the safety of solitude because being seen for strength felt like an invitation to be policed. Jake, who had once fixed an old triumph with a tenderness reserved for the living, learned to wait. Their love, in time, was defined less by fireworks than by reliability. The way he would show up with soup when she was sick, the way she would leave sketches of their little domestic rituals tucked into his toolbox. A year later, they had a wedding of a kind that surprised both worlds. William Whitmore provided a tented stretch in the estate, only enough to shelter the elders and out-of-town guests. The rest of the celebration happened where Jake felt most at home, the garage. They scrubbed the concrete and hung bistro lights. Mechanics polished their best wrenches and traded oil-stained jokes for toasts. Donors from the Whitmore circle mingled with the men who had taught Jake everything from how to patch a tire to how to braid rope. The ceremony was deliberately imperfect and therefore truthful. Charlotte came down the improvised aisle with a walker beside her. It had been adapted, customized with a ribbon, an object of utility turned into a symbol. She took steps with it across the floor, each one negotiated and celebrated, because agency is sometimes choreographed in small increments in public. Jake waited at the end, his hands steady and his face open like a blueprint. He did not promise to fix everything, he promised to keep showing up. He said in a voice that carried a lifetime of now that I know clarity, "I don't need you to be protected. I need you to be you, and I want to be with you." Charlotte answered with the same economy of truth. They exchanged vows that were not crafted for magnates or tabloids, but for two people who had learned to be witnesses to one another. The reception blended motor oil stories and charity anecdotes. Someone toasted the grilled cheese, both a joke and a blessing, and everyone laughed. A stray singer played an old song about oceans and steady feet. When the night wound down and the lights were switched to the softer hum, Charlotte and Jake slipped away to the back alley where a small food truck still offered late-night sandwiches. The vendor, the one who had first served them fries months earlier, smiled and handed them a wrapped sandwich without charge. They ate, elbows touching the metal counter, and felt the assurance of ordinary grace. Months after, the ending they had not announced came quietly, a morning at the beach. The boardwalk gave way to sand, and the sea was a line of polished pewter under sunrise. Charlotte parked her wheelchair at the edge and then, with the help of Jake and a careful plan, stood at the water's edge with the walker. The world watched in that small way that witnesses do, some with astonishment, most with reverence. She took measured steps across the sand, each one a kind of epilogue and beginning entwined. Jake stayed close, his hands a ready support that she could decline or accept on each step. There was no miraculous cure, no tidy erasure of the past. There was instead a visible assertion of her agency. They walked together, ankle deep, and when the sunlight hit the water in a scatter of diamonds, Charlotte turned and, with a dry laugh, folded her hand into Jake's. "I never imagined my blind date disaster would lead me to the poor mechanic who sat at the wrong table," she began, and they both laughed because the sentence mattered more for its truth than its grammar. If this story touched you, like and subscribe for more tales of kindness and love. They returned from the beach with sand in the seams of their shoes and a new quiet between them, the kind that comes after work is done and the tool is put down.
They had arguments, as all couples do who let each other close enough to touch the sore parts. Once, in late winter, Charlotte snapped at Jake for pruning a plant in the garden the wrong way. He, in turn, told her that silence had become a habit she used to avoid asking for help. The fight had no fireworks. It was a letting go in minor keys. They recovered over burnt toast and the same old song from the stray singer who kept turning up at the same small venues. The repair was ordinary. An apology, a roasted coffee bean given to one another as if it were a small reliquary, a mutual decision about the plant's next pruning. Years layered themselves into a kind of single garment. Friends aged and new ones appeared. The shop hosted graduations of mechanics who had once been boys with grease on their knuckles, and Charlotte taught a class on designing for people whose bodies would not be the same tomorrow as they were today. Her students were of all ages, a carpenter learning to widen door frames, a mother sketching a bathroom for a child who would need a wheelchair, a retired teacher learning how to make classrooms simpler and kinder. Jake taught them how to hinge a door so a hand in a cast would not be trapped by it. The instruction was humble and exact. It turned into a curriculum of usefulness. They celebrated small victories like religious people. When the city finally adopted a new set of guidelines, difficult work done by a dozen unglamorous advocates and one very persistent grant application, they threw a party at the garage. It was not a victory lap so much as a communal exhale. Charlotte stood by a string of lights and watched people cross thresholds that once would have stopped them. Men and women who had been turned away from entrepreneurial opportunities found a little more room. The joy was practical, an extra ramp here, a lowered counter there. She and Jake did not stand at the center. They threaded through the crowd, collecting congratulations and the odd compliment and returning them with a joke. On the 10th anniversary of the day they had sat under the bistro lights and traded oil-stained jokes for toasts, Jake and Charlotte sat on the back step of the garage and watched a late summer storm pull across the town. The air hummed with that concentrated kind of stillness that comes before rain, and somewhere a child laughed at the thrill of being sheltered. Jake reached for Charlotte's hand without thinking about whether she would accept his support. She took it because she wanted to, and the choice itself had the savor of a small corollary to freedom. They kept a jar on the mantel where they dropped slips of paper, notes about favors owed, small triumphs, apologies, a phrase that someone had said that made them blush. Over the years, the jar became heavy with the tiny currencies of a communal life. A neighbor's onion marmalade recipe, a young mechanic's letter about how an apprenticeship saved him, a note from William confessing that he had never believed grace could be so ordinary. Sometimes, on mornings when grief came close, an old friend dying, a shop closed for repairs, a donor deciding to move away, they would take a slip from the jar and remember the thread that stitched them back together. When Charlotte's hand started to ache from the arthritis that had waited at the edge of middle age, they adapted again. Jake learned to wake earlier to make tea so she could sleep longer. Charlotte learned to ask for the help that used to feel like failure. They found new ways to be tender. A list of groceries left on the counter, a radio tuned to a station she liked, a novel read aloud in the evenings in the voice he reserved for instruction manuals. The romance of their early misfits had matured into a sturdier language. Smallness made brave. In the end, the thing that had changed the most was not a single miraculous event, but the accumulation of small, deliberate acts. The garage remained a messy cathedral of their making. The tent on the Whitmore lawn still appeared for certain ceremonials. The food truck kept its late-night hours and their favorite sandwich wrapped in paper. People came and went, children grew tall and taller. The town adjusted to them as it adjusts to weather, slowly, imperceptibly, until there is no memory of the first tremor. On evenings when they could, they walked the block, Charlotte with her walker, Jake with his steady step.
Sometimes they paused at the bakery window that had once sold them grilled cheese as a joke and now displayed a plaque someone had tacked up that read, in a font someone else chose, "For ordinary courage." They laughed at the word courageous in that context because bravery looked more like returning phone calls, like showing up for appointments, like remembering names, and then they kept walking. The story did not end with a single bright line. It persisted in habits and in the small, repeated mercies that people offer one another without asking for credit. It lived in the rhythms of two people who had once been strangers at a table and had learned, slowly and by choice, to be a place of rest for each other. They did not change the world in headlines. They changed the world where they could. One door at a time, one grilled cheese at a counter, one borrowed tool returned with a ribbon. On a morning years hence, when the light came in at an angle that made dust motes look like drifting stars, Charlotte unfolded a note she had written and tucked into the jar the night before. It read simply, "Thank you for arriving."
She left it on the mantel and leaned back while Jake made the tea the way she liked it. Too strong for him, perfect for her. And the two of them sat, elbow to elbow, and watched how ordinary grace had, over time, become their true inheritance.